doing it. The way it worked out, I was the only one allowed on the site, so it took me 7 hours to pull the gear down, transport it and re-put it up. And it was a hard gig, I can assure you. The unattended loggers that we had were trying to do full spectrum. We tried to get WAV files in 1/3 octaves, but we ended up having a whole pile of USBs burnt out in sticks and memory cards. We had one meter go back to the manufacturer and they said the coils on the USB board had been burnt out. So these loggers weren't connected to the power, so they were solar and battery, and there were some problems, whether it's electromagnetic radiation, I don't know. Nobody else has had this. But for other researchers, I say earth your microphone and earth your solar panels if you're going to do this again. Because of the data we were trying to do, I came down every 2 weeks to see the residents at Cape Bridgewater. It really is a magnificent place. I went to different sites, but I really went to 3 houses most of the time. The importance of coming down was set right from the outset for the residents. We need to find out what's going on, how you're reacting, what's occurring. Because when they did the South Australian EPA Waterloo study, the EPA never went near the residents. Whereas Adelaide University and I that were down there, we met with residents, talked to them, because we needed that feedback to see what was happening. I had to go to a community consultative meetings to present preliminary results, and some of those were wrong and they were told preliminary and subject to change. Hotspots came as an interesting thing from the outset. Residents had spots where things were worse. Now, it became easy and obvious to me, most of those were reflections. They were alongside a building and the energy coming from the wind farm was being reflected off the building, so it doubled up and you got more energy. Different spots in parts of the houses had that same thing to occur. And we talked about acoustics, and we were in one garage and jumping from side to side, explaining how it sounded different. And they were the hot spots. They were outside. We went to the wind farm, and we went to all of those turbines and the substation, and along Blowholes Road, and Cape Discovery, and Bridgewater Lakes, and Shelley Beach, I think it is, and take those measurements. What was really important, and actually has this study standing out from everybody else, is we had complete shutdowns. They were doing high voltage cabling work, and so what happened was that they pulled the power to the entire wind farm. And what we found out, and is really good thanks to some of the guys that were working on the turbines at the time, when they do a shutdown, which other acousticians have been using, they just stop the turbines. But what actually happens is a whole pile of fans and pumps and equipment inside the towers that are still operating. And some of those make the towers create noise. We can measure vibration and we can measure some noise. So having a complete shutdown where there's absolutely no power stops all of those fans, all of those pumps, all of those computers. Luckily though, we'll see later, the anemometers were working on a universal power supply, so we got some data. And you've already told about the draft report, going to both of them. The measurement analysis procedure is pretty stock standard. It's been done in lots of other places around the world, and it's more than just doing DBA. We did full spectrum, and we took recordings so we could do an analysis of WAV files. Now, people that have looked at this narrowband work, and some of them are there on the list, they too have used this processing and data. So there's nothing really new there. And we had the comparison measurement data on and off, and then we had to look at all the evaluation. 6 terabytes of data is a lot to go through. Okay, propagation of infrasound. People know that I've been talking about the wind turbine signature for a number of years, and the wind turbine signature, not wind turbine syndrome, but wind turbine signature occurs in the infrasound region, and it is the blade pass frequency and multiples of that. We call them harmonics, and they show in the signature. They can vary up and down a little bit, but it's in the infrasound. In Australia, people have presented in some cases that infrasound falls off at a certain rate. What happens is that, I'll use light for a lot of times. As you go further away from a light bulb, it becomes weaker and you don't have much energy. The same thing with noise. The further you go away, it becomes quieter. Now, normally on the dBA basis, people use 6 dB per doubling. Now, what does that mean? It means every time you double the distance, the level goes down 6 dB. So if you start at 40 dB at 1 kilometre, it becomes 34 at 2, becomes 28 at 4, keeps going on that progression. However, infrasound falls off at a different rate, although some people will tell you it doesn't. So, Massachusetts Turbine Impact Study is a study that's been often talked about as a peer review. It was really a desktop study by a group of people, but in the executive summary, they actually tell in that mumbo-jumbo there that infrasound runs differently to normal sound. And so they also talk about when you do this whole frequency analysis, the data they had didn't say what was going on, so you couldn't compare apples with apples. So it's a report to say, if I'm going to give this information, I need to provide it all together. The other part on page 61, which seems to be never mentioned when anybody talks about this study, is it said, hey, more work is needed to be done. And that's the fact that people are trying to do around the world. Next. Using the southern section of the wind farm, those 3 loggers, A, B and C, which went out past South 88 and across the Bridgewater bridge, across the road, or the Blowholes Road, sorry, there for a few days, and the data looks at it and they fall along some lines. The green is the furthest one, and it starts to get down into some of the ambient noise levels. Next. Using the turbines, if we first take it as the nearest turbine, we had our 500 metres, 1,002 kilometres. That's an electric fence over there, and I've got Zach trying to get over the fence with me here. But what happens is, it's not the noise just from the nearest turbine, so some of them move back. When we looked at this, for doing the distances, we moved them back to a centre, an acoustic centre of 200 metres back. Next. When we did this in the DBA, we got this 6 dB propagation. The yellow lines are 6 dB per doubling, and we've broken it up into different wind speeds, and we can see that it falls off, and this is a downwind configuration. It was just a westerly. Next. However, when we took the infrasound down at 2.5 Hertz, and if we take the frequency of 0.8, then that becomes the third harmonic, it's not 6 dB per doubling, because the 6 dB is the yellow lines, and these graphs are not that. So we've got a different rate which is lower, which what other international experts have found. Next. When they monitor around the world for nuclear explosions, they actually have people that do this full time. They have massive grids of vibration detectors in the ground that are like 10 kilometres by 10 kilometre grids, and they've got infrasound microphones. These guys have been doing it for a while, and they do know what they're talking about. That's probably light years ahead of what we were doing when we started. But here's a group of people that look at the infrasound, and if we take the line here and we say that that's 63, and that's 1 kilometre, if we come back to here, which is twice the distance, then if it was 6 dB per doubling, sorry, if we call that 68, it would be down here. So the curve says to me, and a few other acousticians that are around the place, that that's not 6 dB per doubling. Next one. Well, these guys get to go to great conferences. Look at that, Tahiti. This graph actually is a good graph for everybody to understand, because what it shows is that when it's the green line is no wind, nothing's going on. None of these peaks. When we go to the red, it's doing 20 RPM, and we get these peaks. There. And when we go to 26 RPM, we get the peaks, but they shift up because it's got a greater speed. And this is the wind turbine signature. And as I said, it's Portland, we're not in Tahiti, but I'd like to go there next. Okay, we tried with the residents before it started, tried the South Australian EPA questionnaire that was done. And they came back and said, look, this doesn't work. It's got holes in it, it's ambiguous, we don't understand some of these things. So we've got a different complaint methodology which has been used for a wind farm noise, and they provided a ranking 1 to 5, and the residents said, yeah, that seems to work better. And when we talked about it, 5 was a severe impact. Well, what they did is said, look, we think 5 is when it's so bad we've got to leave our houses. So 5 in their concept was leaving their houses. 5 in this concept is physically harmful, and you can read what it says. And that's That's very important if we're trying to look at whatever we're doing to protect people. Next. If we took the classifications and changed noise to vibration or changed noise to sensation, then that's the way that the study worked. So we had 3 different groups of their expressions of what they would do. And sensation came from the people of Waterloo in that study, because in May 2013, in taking measurements of houses, I had this view that there was something that they could detect. They couldn't see the wind farm, but they could tell me that it was on. So I sort of hounded these residents when I was there, tell me, can you feel it? Tell me. And in the end, they could walk out of the room and just wave their hand, yes or no. And what I found was that there were certain frequencies and levels at 4 and 5 hertz in narrow band, about 50 dB, seemed to be when they could notice it. So I had a concept of feeling. And this is what I brought to the residents and said, look, over in South Australia, they actually have what they feel, and we'll call it a sensation, and these are the things that occur. They all looked at it and they said, yes, that actually fits what's going on, and we shouldn't have been complaining about noise, because really what we've been getting is sensation. So for the residents and for us looking at this matter, that was a pretty important function to occur. Going through the notes and what the residents have written from this study, I had to do that in answer a question. I would be adding to sensation, pulsation and fatigue, because it appears amazingly a lot of times. Next. Alright, we had a lot of trouble about how could we get across the residents' observations in a format that could be understood. We tried lots of things, and in the end, this is the way we did it. Arrows that go, blue is noise, green is vibration, and red is sensation. And in the arrows, we put the number of the severity. And so this is 2 houses, same day, and there are 4 residents that are putting input into this. The one's going down, and the one's going up. So in this graph, we've only got a few for one person and a lot for another. Over here, we've got a few for one person and a smaller number for the other. Now, they're not always at home, so that gives us an answer. And so we can cut off another question later. This stuff, when I talk in a little bit more detail, is a shutdown. And there's no power coming out of the turbines. There are sensations that are recorded, and they're recorded because I asked the residents to try and do this on a 1 or 2 hour basis and put what's going on. So yes, they're talking about some noise or talking about some sensation, but if you look at it, it's of much lower value than what happens when the turbines are operating. Because when we started, the residents were doing the diary, we got the results, which actually led to the hypothesis, and they were only reporting changes. And we looked at it, and I'll explain shortly how we got to that point. We found that they were only talking about changes. That's when they wrote it down. And we said, sorry, we actually want to get this continuous logging. And other researchers in doing their studies about noise from wind farms didn't realise as well that residents were only putting down changes. So I spoke to the residents in Waterloo in the EPA study and said, is this what you're doing? And they said, yes. We didn't know we had to do it all the time. So for people doing the studies in terms of wind farms and socioacoustic work, that became an important finding. Next. Okay, we took all this data, masses of data, and we were trying to look at different curves that are used. And what happens is, for acousticians, they will see immediately that this is a dBA curve, the orange one. It wipes out all the low frequencies, which is why it's pretty useless for looking at impact from turbines. The blue one is a dBc. These are filters that are applied. The red one is dB linear. This is a dBg, the green one. The light blue one here is an LSL, which is from Dr. Kelly, the NASA work in the 1980s. And it's really the dBg just shifted up to 50 hertz. These two down here are actually audibility curves. Wattenby and Moller are people that you'll get reference to where they had people listening on headphones to pure tones to work out their thresholds in the infrasound. Normally, they're expressed up that way to show the audibility. This is the curves that we applied. in our assessment. The Danish EPA have a concept called a dBA-LF, low frequency, which limits itself between 10 Hertz and 160 Hertz, about there. So it's looking at low frequency noise. So we did that, but we also might have dBc, and it'll go to 10 Hertz, and then dBc extension goes down to 0.8 of a Hertz. So we did all that to try and develop what was going on. Here we go. Okay, this is a bit of the nitty-gritty about how we tried to do it. Because we have access to the wind farm data, we have the wind speed that comes from the turbines. This is House 87, so this is the southern part of the turbines. We only use those 17 turbines, we forget about the rest of it, and we can see what the wind is doing. We can see what its direction is doing, and we can see what the output power is just for those 17 turbines. I think this is a better way for the wind because the wind mast is at one spot, and if you go and stand on that wind farm, you'll find turbines are operating at different speeds and at times pointing in different directions. So we took the arithmetic average of the 17 wind turbines for our data for the southern end, and for the northern end we took the average of 5 wind farms, turbines. Now what happens is we get some changes. This was the way that we plotted it, and when we looked for some changes we got a 5 and we started looking. And what I told the residents at the consultative meeting, I was working on patterns. I had an entire wall plastered in A3 pictures of these, looking for what the patterns were. And what happened is we got this information that stood out to tell us what's going on. If I change over to this side by using the data, because that one's all just dBA, and you don't really see much that goes on. In this we tried, this should be a dBg, if I'm reading it correctly. This one is a dBc extended. This one is a Danish dBA-LF, and this is an L90. Now the L90 that comes out of the meter inside the bedroom of this house sets stuff all because it's reached the noise floor of the meter. When you get to this type of work, you've got to have really good gear, not go to your Tandy store and buy a sound level meter type thing. And so this is calculated out from the data, and we thought in the early stage that dBA was following the turbines. Okay, now this is where we got into it. People have asked the questions, how did we find this hypothesis? Well, we had the 4s and we get the 5s and we get the changes, and we look for what's going on. Because we've got the data and nobody else has had this before, we could expand the view. So we've got problems where there's a sensation increases. The dBA won't tell us anything. But what we do is that we can blow up the wind farm power and we can blow up the wind speed. And this is actually pretty low power. And we can see that the wind speed, and if you take the 5 metres per second they cut out, it actually went below it. And so we can see that there's a change in the power. We can see here when we get another one, it's going up and down quite significantly. So that's how we came up with the hypothesis. Low wind speed, change of 20% up or down, and high wind speed. Okay, I've just said that not all the turbines operate the same way. Here's 3 of them, or 6 of them, but these are the 3 being the nearest to House 88 and 87. And what happens is if you look at it, it's relatively low speed, it's the early hours of morning, we had some sensations that occur, and they're not all operating. They're not the same. We look at the power output, they drop up and down. We look at the wind speed, they drop up and down. One even sort of goes 360 degrees turning. Over here we've got another group, they move around. Next.